As we've been looking at Siren 2, we've also been looking at some external websites that share a bit more of the story, shed a bit more light. Well, there's one website that is not mentioned in the game, and I was not aware of it myself. So thank you to Ludzu for linking me to this. It's a short story. Siren 2, The Mystery of the Bright Wind. 4 chapters, and you can see the website at the bottom where you can read this. This website does use Flash, so you will need to play Flash. It also says some pages contain sound files. No sound plays for me here, so I don't know if there's something wrong here or if there's something wrong with the website. But we will play maybe some Siren 2 music while we read this spooky story. This story that will tell us what happened on the Bright Wind. So, let us begin with this. Ichiko Yagura, Bright Wind, Boarding Gate. Chapter 1. Warning. It began with a strange warning. Ichiko Yagura heard the final call for the ferry. She stood before the boarding area, holding a paper bag full of souvenirs tightly to her chest. She let out a small sigh of relief. She had made it in time. Preoccupied with choosing gifts for her family, when she had come back down to Earth, she was already alone. She hastily ran to the pier, breathing hard, her uniform damp with sweat and the sea air. I wish Noriko had let me know before she got on the ferry, she grumbled mentally, thinking of her friend who had boarded and left her behind. She pulled herself together and looked up at the boarding area, stepping onto the metal gangway. She stumbled on her right leg, her body suddenly jerking backwards. Feeling a sharp pain in the upper arm that was exposed for her uniform, Ichiko's face contorted in pain. Turning around, a dark black shadow caught Ichiko's eye. Because of the lighting, it took her a few seconds to figure out what it was. As her eyes got used to the light, she slowly began to notice it. It was a strange figure, wrapped in several layers of stained, tattered cloth due to some odd eccentricity. She guessed from its slight build that it was a woman, but because it was covered so thickly with cloth from head to toe that she couldn't see its face. For a moment, her sense of reality was shaken, the ominous sight of such a dark black shadow being created there and there alone, under the midsummer sky. But the arm that reached out from the rags and was grabbing onto Ichiko's arm was so white that it looked almost transparent. Don't get on. As the clearly bizarre woman held onto her arm, Ichiko was unable to move as though paralyzed. The woman slowly looked up. She caught a glimpse of the woman's eyes and nothing more through a gap in the rags. All Ichiko could see of the woman was her eyes, but the woman's gaze saw past Ichiko, fixed on the ferry. You must not get on this ferry. Ichiko was suddenly hit with severe dizziness, and she began to sway. Ichiko tore herself away from the woman's grasp and turned her back. She hurried up the gangway without turning around. The woman's curse-like words continued from behind. Don't circle. Torn. Warped. Don't get on. You okay, Yagura? Ichiko came back down to Earth. Surveying the reality she had been dragged back to, she realized she was in the ferry's dining room. Ichiro Nakajima, having returned from the buffet line, peered at Ichiko's face. All around them, their classmates were talking casually as they ate their dinner. Oh yeah, I'm fine, Ichiko answered hurriedly, and spooned some of her half-eaten curry and rice into her mouth. Ichiko hadn't told anyone about the events that had occurred when she was boarding. If everyone else had been there and experienced it too, by now they would have gotten to a big excitement over it all, and then forgotten it in a flash. Why was she the only one chosen to experience that unpleasant incident? She felt as though she had gotten herself involved in something forbidden that should be left well alone. The ominous thought frightened Ichiko. You've been sleeping with your eyes open all this time, Yagura. Nakajima set his tray down, not directly opposite Ichiko. Huh? No. I'm wide awake. Even without looking in the mirror, she knew her face was red. Nakajima, who had transferred to their school from Kansai the year before, had a more mature air about him than the local boys. Whenever she was around him, she always kept her eyes on the ground. Ignoring the way Ichiko was acting, Nakajima silently moved the spoon to his mouth. "Are you depressed? I guess it's 'cause the final event is over." Ichiko and the others were members of Kamishino Middle School's tennis club and were on the ferry back to their local harbor after a prefectural tournament. It was a miracle that they had even been able to compete in the tournament, but it was natural to have higher hopes for a good result than it was probably possible for them to achieve. When the tournament was over, a new test, high school entrance exams, awaited. After the contest, everyone was in such high spirits, as if they had forgotten the reality of this. "Huh? Hey, where's Noriko?" Ichiko murmured, looking over the empty seat to her right. She said she was feeling seasick and went to the first aid room with Mr. Watanabe a little while ago. "Oh, yeah, she's always been really prone to motion sickness." Noriko's plate had been left almost untouched. "She doesn't look the type, though." "Ah, maybe you're feeling sick too?" "No, I'm fine, just a little out of it." She hastily shook her head at Nakajima's question, smiling at him. "What's that? You're such an idiot, Yagura." Ichiko began an over-the-top joke in front of the amazed-looking Nakajima. She didn't want her last memory of the tennis club to be sullied by the strange woman's words, and more than anything, a strange obsession during the teen years. Ichiko was afraid that Nakajima would think she was a gloomy person. "Okay, let's have an eating contest." Rarely heard words came as she stood up vigorously with her empty plate. A corpse. Ichiko momentarily stopped moving. "I told you, I saw it! A real dead body!" She looked around her. Her classmates were talking excitedly at the table next to hers. "The ferry stopped for a bit today, right? I guess that was so they could pull up the body." "I found it first! It was a woman's body!" "But they roped it off right away and told us to go. I wonder where they put it." "How about we all go search the ferry afterwards?" "Hey, you guys, stop talking about nasty things like dead bodies while we're eating." "Hey, shh!" When they noticed the cold stares of families with young children and young couples directed at them, her classmates finally shut their mouths. A corpse. The feeling of unease inside her that Ichiko had tried to forget began to spread. Something pierced her insides like a stuck thorn. Ichiko lay on her bed in the second-class cabin. It was after lights out, and the cabin was enveloped in darkness. She could hear the regular breathing of her classmates, who had grown tired of talking and fallen asleep. The sound of the ferry's engine echoed faintly. Ichiko thought of what it was that was making her so uneasy. Ichiko picked up the bracelet from beside the bed. It was a matching bracelet she had bought with her friend, Noriko. Ichiko's was red, while Noriko had chosen green. It was only a cheap imitation gem, of course, but to Ichiko, it was an irreplaceable treasure. Ichiko had an admiration of and attachment to Noriko, which girls of this age often feel towards friends of the same gender. Whether it was to teachers or to the opposite sex, Noriko was always able to say what she felt with resolution. Ichiko, being the most childish out of all her classmates, dreamt of this. "We'll be friends forever, right?" They had promised that over and over. She looked forlornly over at Noriko's bed, but it had been empty since dinner. Maybe Noriko wouldn't be back until morning. Ichiko gave up on waiting for Noriko's return and covered herself with a blanket, trying to sleep, but sleep would not come. She tried to remember the monotonous ball retrieval she had done over and over at the club when she was a first year. She counted the infinite number of balls rolling towards her. Finally, she was able to sleep. She heard clothes rustling by her ear. Her eyes flew open. Thinking Noriko had returned, Ichiko looked around her. Noriko's bed was still empty. Ichiko shut her eyes tight. She felt uneasy, as though something was lurking in the pitch blackness. She felt as though she could feel someone staring at her from the darkness. When she came back to her senses, the sun was coming up. Nothing had happened after all. Feeling relieved, Ichiko relaxed. During the morning, dregs of anxiety occasionally appeared faintly, rising up from her memory. But as she ate lunch, enjoying the summer sun on deck, the fear that had tormented Ichiko vanished. The summer sun beat down on her. A pleasant sea breeze blew in from the water. That evening, they would arrive safely back at their home port. Then, for some reason, it seemed strange that she had been so afraid. What had happened was creepy, but now it just seemed unreal, like a simple, fabricated ghost story. "Ichiko, look over here!" Another student was aiming a disposable camera that had been in a TV advert at her, waving. "Cheese!" Ichiko called back, making a peace sign. "I just made too much of it," she thought. By the afternoon, Noriko still hadn't returned, so Ichiko headed for the first aid room to see her. The 6-story ship was surprisingly big. Descending the stairs, she wandered its dim corridors. From inside the passage, she could hear men talking as she approached, who appeared to be crew members. "Damn it! There was nothing wrong on last night's patrol. This is so weird. What the hell happened? Anyway, we'll be porting soon, so as soon as we do... But I wish we hadn't picked up something so nasty. It's nothing special." "Hey." One of the crew members noticed Ichiko, and his companion fell silent. A tense atmosphere surrounded them as they stood there. Not understanding what was going on, Ichiko slipped past them and hurried away. Why are they looking at me like that? It felt like the crew members had been staring at her back forever. Something feels off about this. The feeling of anxiety that should have been gone returned once more, settling in Ichiko's chest. The sinister premonition in her head grew. It was an unpleasant feeling that clung on tightly, however hard she tried to shake it off. She walked down the long hallway and turned the corner. Suddenly, Ichiko's nose caught a fishy smell. She looked around her cautiously. At the end of the corridor, she could see a door with first aid written on it. With each step she took, the odor grew stronger. All around her hung the smell of something like rotten fish insides. Arriving at the door, she gingerly put her hand on the doorknob. From the other side of the door, she could hear what sounded like something heavy being dragged along. She sensed the temperature in the room drop. Her spontaneous shivering wasn't just because of the cold. A cold sweat broke out all over her body. A warning echoed inside her head, and her heart began to pound. Unable to hide her fear, Ichiko called out to the other side of the door. "Noriko! It's me, Ichiko! Are you there?" There was no response. Even though she knew in her heart that she should get out of there right away, she resisted, and her body began to move of its own accord. She turned the doorknob with the stiffness of a puppet and opened the door. The strong, fishy smell assaulted Ichiko, and her eyes jumped to the bed with the crumpled white sheets on it. Noriko wasn't there. Standing beside the empty bed was a woman dressed in a slightly dirty first aid blanket. Her damp hair was tangled and plastered to her face, so she couldn't tell whether or not the woman was looking at her. The blanket the woman wore bulged strangely, white feet poking out from under the hem. She was white as a deep-sea creature that had never once seen sunlight. From between her feet, 2 more legs simply protruded. Worn-out leather shoes fell on the floor. Those were the shoes Mr. Watanabe, the advisor, wore. She remembered how, even though everyone told him he should get new ones, he always scratched his head, smiling embarrassedly. A wet, awful sound. It was like a sticky mass flowing from a drain. And then she heard a cracking sound, like a house rattling. The advisor's legs convulsed faintly as they were gradually sucked inside the blanket. The stomach inside the woman's blanket bulged bizarrely, writhing as though it was a completely different being. Its movement was disgusting, making her feel nauseous. Suddenly, like a spring-loaded toy, the advisor's feet shot up, and the blanket-wearing woman fell to the floor. The woman stood openly naked. A thick liquid trickled down her white, melted wax-like skin. The advisor's feet poked out of her abdomen as though misshapen clay, and his face sank into her chest. The white flesh that enclosed his face trembled as it bulged. The face, only with its expression of pain and fear, gradually sank into the flesh. Only his eyeballs remained visible on the surface of the skin, seeming to drift about as they hung from the woman's stomach. A lump swelled in her flank, stretching the skin until it split open. From the tear in the skin, out poked the advisor's right arm. The arm groped around blindly, as though trying to grab onto empty space. The woman's pallid skin trembled as it moved about. The fingertips extended further, as though trying to escape from the body. The nails at the tips grew rapidly. They kept growing longer, tangling like ivy and hanging all the way down to her feet. Ichiko pressed both hands against her mouth. From the gap between her hands spilled an unstoppable scream. The woman sluggedly turned to look at her.
Don't take this ferry.
As Ichiko's vision began to fade, she remembered the strange warning. To be continued. Well, she took the ferry, so it is a bit late for that. Well, things not going too well in Chapter 1. Let's move on to Chapter 2 and see how things might go. This time it's Ichiro Nakajima, Bright Wind, Port Deck. Strange occurrence, like the turning of a Mobius strip, daily life and abnormality reverse. The setting sun glittered red on the water. Ichiro Nakajima narrowed his eyes at the sparkle. With both hands on the iron guardrail on the ferry's portside deck, he watched the sea pass by. Despite the beauty of Mother Nature that lay before him, Nakajima's heart was full of melancholy. He had no idea what to do about the problem he was facing at such an age. He reached inside the pocket of his school trousers. The existence of the letter that his fingertips brushed against showed that it was real after all. There's something I'm really worried about. When Noriko had fell ill at dinner yesterday and he had taken her to the first aid room, she had slipped him the letter without anyone else noticing. Nakajima waited for midnight, making sure his classmates were all asleep, and then sneaked out of bed. Noriko waited for Nakajima under the dim emergency lighting, cradling her knees. She smiled, her face pale, trying not to open her mouth too much. It made him feel anxious, but Nakajima waited with the patience for her confession. When Noriko opened her mouth to confide her troubles in him, it had a greater than expected impact on Nakajima, and he couldn't hide his intense trembling. Even if he had, in a way, sensed the possibility this might be coming. A year ago, when he had transferred to Kamishino Middle School, his classmates surveyed him from a distance, unsure how to talk to a boy so obviously from the city. Nakajima, reluctant to transfer schools after his parents' sudden divorce, had completely given up on trying to make friends. And then after school one day, one of the girls from his class stood in front of him as he was preparing to go home, blocking the way. "Join the tennis club, Nakajima! Weren't you in the tennis club at your old school?" Nakajima was irritated by and opposed to the girl trying to drag him off to the club room. "I don't know who you are, but will you stop trying to tell me what to do?" Unflinching at the sharp way he spoke to her, the girl kept trying to persuade him to go to the tennis club with her. At first, Nakajima had felt depressed, but eventually he gave in to her daily efforts of persuasion. The day he submitted his club application to the advisor and was on his way home, the girl appeared before him again. "I'm so happy. It'll be fun watching you play tennis," she said with a shy smile, and then ran away, and Nakajima watched her retreating back for ages. Because of this incident, Nakajima became well aware of Noriko. Nakajima let out a big sigh. He couldn't get the sound of Noriko's tearful voice out of his head. "What do I do? Ichiro, what do I do? I'm so scared." High school and university, along with a future full of boundless possibility, all of these options were rapidly being closed off. The Noriko he had given moral support to now felt as though she was stealing his future away from him. He saw the face of his father and his grieving mother, betrayed by her own son. "Tell me what to do. I've no idea." As thoughts swam through his head, Nakajima gripped the railing in front of him tightly. He held on with such force that the blood drained from his knuckles, turning them white. He felt as though if he let go, the vast sea before him would swallow him whole. A small raindrop fell onto Nakajima's cheek. Feeling a chill from the calming sea breeze, he suddenly felt as though the area had gotten dark. Looking up, he saw clouds floating in the sky that looked dark as mud. Soon after, a heavy rain began to fall. Looking around him, he saw that he was the only one on the portside deck. Had the other passengers guessed that rain was coming and gone inside? Compared to how quiet the sea had been only moments before, the waves had become fiercer. The boat tossed and turned so that even if he held onto the railing, he might have been thrown overboard. The rapid change in weather made Nakajima feel uncomfortable. An emergency announcement was broadcast throughout the ferry. On his way back inside, Nakajima headed towards the on-deck door. As he reached his hand out for the doorknob, a raging wave slammed against the side of the boat and it rocked violently. Losing his footing on the deck, slippery with the salty air, he slipped. Gripping the wall with one hand, Nakajima pulled himself back upright and made for the heavy iron door. A strong impact hit him on the back of the head. His vision blurred red and began to tunnel, and Nakajima sank into the deep black of unconsciousness. When he awoke, he was surrounded by deep, starless blackness. The rain had stopped, and the boat's fierce rocking had also subsided. Bringing his hand to the ache on the back of his head where the blow had connected, Nakajima stood up. How long was I out for? He held his left wrist up to his face. His watch was stopped at 4:44 p.m. Looking down at the sea over the railing, he saw a black mass floating by the hull. He didn't know had happened or what was going on. Enduring the pain in his head, Nakajima continued back inside the boat. The feeling of the letter at his fingertips showed that this was definitely real. The ship's interior was dim, lit only by emergency lights. Perhaps the power had gone off. He couldn't hear the usually incessant noise of the engine, and silence engulfed him. Suddenly, amidst the silence and the darkness, Nakajima felt an instinctive fear. From the entrance, he could see a whitish lump on the stairs up to the second floor. He set his gaze on it for some time, and realized that it was a middle-aged woman. A passenger? The middle-aged woman was sitting on the stairs, head down, leaning against the wall. Her body trembled here and there unnaturally as she let out muffled sobs. As Nakajima approached her, her upper body shot back like a coiled spring. Nakajima's breath caught in shock. The woman's eyes widened, the bright red and bloodshot. Our daughter was my husband and I's dearest treasure, you know. And my husband, trying to protect her, caused such a fuss. Everyone was in such a fuss. It was so ridiculous, and I was so scared I couldn't move. And that woman... As the woman babbled meaningless words, drool frothed out of her mouth. A feeling of revulsion slithered through Nakajima's body, but the woman kept staring at the now empty space where Nakajima had been, continuing to mutter. Nakajima ran up the stairs to the second floor at once, leaving the woman alone. He stepped inside the second-floor cabin corridor until he had come here. He hadn't seen anyone besides the deranged middle-aged woman from before. The boat should have been packed with tourists, but everyone had vanished. Feeling a constricting panic, Nakajima's heart pounded like an alarm bell. The darkness surrounding him had a thickness to it, seeming to follow him. Something must have happened, and everyone was evacuated somewhere, that's all. As he tried to persuade himself of this, Nakajima walked along the long, dark corridor. He just wanted to see the face of someone familiar. The second-class cabin door was open. All Nakajima could see through the half-open door was someone turning their head towards him. Remembering a pen light he had brought at the gift shop before boarding the ferry, he dug it out of his pocket. He switched it on and aimed the beam of light at the figure. He could just about make out the pale face of his classmate, Kazuo Inada. Though suspicion of the unsteady frame sticking half out the door, Nakajima breathed a momentary sigh of relief. "What you doing, Inada?" Why'd the boat stopped? Where's everyone's gotten to? In response to Nakajima's questions, Inada's eyes opened wide and his mouth flapped open and closed. It looked as though he was desperately trying to say something, but no voice came out. Suddenly, a strong, rotten smell prickled at Nakajima's nose. It seemed to be coming from behind Inada, from inside the second-class cabin. As Nakajima reflexively covered his nose, the door opened wide. The entirety of Inada's upper body appeared in the corridor, and it looked as though there was a stark naked woman behind him. It looked like some kind of sick joke. Inada's torso grew out of the woman's abdomen. His lower body had completely vanished inside her stomach, the joint covered with a white lump of flesh. From every part of the woman's body there haphazardly protruded human arms, legs, and heads writhing around. The penlight fell out of Nakajima's hand and tumbled to the floor. Inada thrust his arms out, as though trying to escape from the woman's stomach. The more he struggled, the deeper inside the flesh his body was sucked. Nakajima watched, unblinking. Time slowed down, and the scene before him played out as though in slow motion. Inada held out both arms from the crawling mass of flesh, as though begging for help. He felt as though he heard a voice saying,
"Help me, Nakajima."
That moment, Nakajima snapped out of it and ran over, grabbing onto the arms. Exerting all of his strength and body weight as he tugged, the flesh emitted a ripping sound. Momentum knocked him onto his backside. Something like white lard sprayed into his eyes, and he blinked reflexively. He had been gripping Inada's arm in his hand, but the arms ended at the shoulders. The torn bases extended like a sugar sculpture, and from them white juice dripped onto the floor. Nakajima screamed, but his voice would barely come out. With a mystified expression on her face, the woman looked back and forth from the hole in her stomach to Nakajima. He caught a glimpse of her face through her damp black hair. Her features were so beautiful she hardly looked real. Her skin, so fair, was almost transparent. Her big, glistening eyes, her full lips like red petals. The woman drew the corners of her moist lips up into a smile. It was a smile so sinister that it made the hair on his body stand up. The white arm extended smoothly, reminiscent of a mollusk, and the woman's fingertips brushed against Nakajima's cheek. "I have to get out of here," he thought, but his body wouldn't move an inch. Nakajima shut his eyes in despair. "I can't get away!" Then the shrill sound of the emergency bell cut through the air. For a moment, the woman's fingers paused. Nakajima didn't miss his chance. He used his momentum to spring up, turn on his heel, and fled at full speed. He ran down the long corridor, down the stairs, and through the door. Everything he saw was a blur. Feeling as though the woman was following him the whole way, Nakajima kept running desperately. Approaching the door in front of him, he slammed into it hard and dove out into the air beyond. He felt the sea breeze shifting through the night air. He was on the front deck. Of course, there were no passengers or crew about. It was just him on deck with the sea and the darkness, which spread out around him like mud. Making sure that no one was behind him, Nakajima slumped to the ground. His lungs screamed, his head in so much pain he felt as though it would split. He knelt down, both hands on the ground, and vomited violently. His whole body trembled and convulsed as he threw up over and over until his stomach was empty. When he had finished being sick, Nakajima's face was damp with tears and mucus. "This ain't possible! Has everyone been eaten by that monster?" Through a gap in the second-class cabin door, all he could see was several school uniforms scattered around the room. "Noriko as well?" he murmured, his voice cracking, hanging his head and cradling it. Nakajima was filled with weariness and despair, unable to go on. He was still only a 14-year-old boy, and it was too much for him to take. Occasionally, screams echoed throughout the ship. He would hear a bitter shout and sinister laughing, and then after a while, all went silent again. Nakajima wrapped his arms around his knees and watched the dark sky and seas, but his eyes were unseeing. How long had passed? To Nakajima, it seemed like forever. From somewhere he heard a faint, somehow familiar-sounding scream. Nakajima's numbness began to subside. That voice! Nakajima stood, looking at the upper hull area from the front deck. A big window made of thick glass, and on the other side of it stood a figure in a school uniform. It was definitely Noriko. Nakajima felt the blood rush to his head. His blood vessels throbbed hard, his whole body so hot it felt like he was burning. Nakajima began to run towards the wheelhouse. Running up the dark, narrow stairs, Nakajima rushed into the wheelhouse. In the center, there stood a row of control panels, and in front of those there was a glass window that stretched out 180 degrees. And nearby, where he had seen her standing, Noriko lay sprawled out onto the floor. Beside her was a white shadow, a grotesque woman with tentacles of white flesh dangling from her abdomen. The mass of flesh approached Noriko, dragging them along the ground. Noriko! Nakajima bellowed with all the strength his trembling body could muster. He squared his upper body and charged at the woman with his head lowered. The woman dodged with surprising agility, attacking Nakajima. Nakajima's body flew through the air, slamming into the glass window. He crumpled to the floor. His vision grew hazy, and the taste of iron spread through his mouth. He put his hand to the back of his head, and his palm was smeared with liquid. Perhaps due to the large amount of adrenaline pumping through him, Nakajima felt no pain, but his body felt numb, and he couldn't move. The woman lost interest in Nakajima and began to head for Noriko once more. "No, I gotta protect Noriko!" In response to Nakajima's cry of pain, a single phrase echoed in his mind. "Use the light!" The voice seemed to be calling out directly to Nakajima from somewhere distant. It was the first time he had ever felt anything like it in his life. As though by someone else's will, Nakajima's body began to move. Reaching for his signal lamp that had been positioned in the window frame, he aimed it at the grotesque woman. Pulling the trigger, a bright light emitted from the end. Caught in the beam of light, the woman threw her head far back, exposing her pale throat. A pained howl filled the wheelhouse. The woman threw herself to the ground as if trying to get away from the light. White smoke rose from her body as she crawled around, seeking the darkness. The woman dove from the darkness outside of the wheelhouse. The next second, he heard the sound of the heavy lump of flesh tumbling down the stairs. I protected Noriko. The thought made Nakajima feel elated, and he felt the strange force passing. For a moment he stayed there, his eyes closed. He gradually regained consciousness. Realizing he had passed out, Nakajima desperately searched for Noriko through his blurred vision. Noriko lay a few meters away, in the same position as she had been in before. It looked like she was still unconscious, but she didn't seem injured. He stared at Noriko. His brain sprang to life. Warm tears spilled down his cheeks. The tears kept coming. The blocks in his head and chest melted and were washed away with the tears. I won't give up with you, Noriko. I'll protect you no matter what. We'll be together forever. Nakajima rushed over to Noriko and lifted her up. Her body was so heavy. http://www.w3tv.org/. His body was clouded by tears. He saw Noriko's eyelids trembling slightly. Nakajima loved Noriko from the bottom of his heart. Noriko's eyelids opened. Shock showed in her eyes, and her face instantly went blue and pale. Nakajima didn't understand what it meant. He followed and reached out his hand to Noriko as she desperately tried to scoot away from him. Her body is so heavy, Nakajima thought. To be continued. Well, things continue to get worse on board the Bright Wind, though, as far as right now, Ichiro and Noriko are still alive. Let's move on to Chapter 3, which is Ichiko on board the Bright Wind, of course. Curse. The warning became a curse, tracking down its prey, heading for the decided conclusion. Ichiko Yagura awoke on the concrete, the smell of dust and mold filling her nostrils. She slowly opened her eyes. She felt a chill and shivered. The concrete had stolen her body heat, and Ichiko's body was freezing all over. Sitting up, she reached out to brush off her exposed legs. Her hand stopped midway. She remembered something terrible and unbelievable. Why had she been sleeping in a place like this? Where was she? As she woke up, a crushing anxiety quickly filled her chest, something like a horrible nightmare. As she thought, she heard a rustling of damp clothes. She saw a figure out of the corner of her eye. Goosebumps instantly appeared on Ichiko's skin. She couldn't move. She kept silent, not even daring to exhale. Her throat constricted. Her tongue stiffened and dried up. She turned her eyes towards the sound as though drawn by a magnet. Little by little, her eyes grew accustomed to the darkness. Ichiko saw her, the woman standing frozen there, clad in a slightly dirty blanket. And then she remembered the strange incident she had witnessed just before she lost consciousness. This isn't a dream. Her own frightened voice echoed in her head. Ichiko stood, leaping back, and ran. Absorbed, she ran through the empty room, surrounded by concrete walls on all sides. It was hard to move, like running through water. The next second, she banged into something and fell forwards with a crash. The obstacle before her, it was the elevator door. She pressed the button over and over, almost punching it. It seemed like an eternity passed before the doors finally opened. Ichiko prayed as she felt something creeping up behind her. Hurry, 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 hurry! Ichiko dove through the space between the doors. She spun around and pressed the close button. On the other side of the closing door, she could see the woman approaching. The blanket that had covered her head had slipped down to her shoulders, her face poking out, her wet black hair, her translucent white skin, her big, glistening black eyes. It sounded as though her moist, red lips were trying to utter something. The moment she spoke, the doors slammed shut. The strength seeped out of Ichiko's body, and she crumpled to the floor. The elevator was bare and dreary, perhaps used for transporting luggage. Ichiko sat with her legs crossed and stared at the blinking floor indicator above her head. Who was that woman? What had Ichiko been doing there? Various questions she couldn't understand swam around in Ichiko's head. She trembled slightly, her teeth chattering, trying to stop herself shaking. Ichiko wrapped her arms tightly around herself. The elevator arrived at Biff, and the doors opened. Ichiko mustered her strength and stood. The corridor turned left ahead of the elevator. Turning the corner, she continued up the gloomy stairs. Looking over her shoulder, she checked that no one was following her. Turning back around, she shouted as loud as she could into the darkness that covered the stairs. Anyone? Is anyone there? Anybody? The only answer to Ichiko's call was the echo of her own voice. Making up her mind, she ascended the stairs and continued along the corridor that stretched out before her. She neither saw nor sensed anyone else inside the ship. Ichiko's sense of direction was muddled due to fear. Groping her way along the wall, Ichiko proceeded one step at a time. Opening the door, she found herself on the side deck. On the opposite deck was the entrance. If she could get there, she might be able to find someone. Feeling a faint hope, she walked out onto the darkness-enveloped deck. There was a strangely fishy sea breeze. The boat had stopped. There was no one. Why is this only happening to me? She wondered. Ichiko walked with caution across the slippery deck, making it harder to move. She held on tightly with both hands, her whole body stiff. Gotta get to the entrance. Making it across the deck, she opened the door that had led inside the boat. Proceeding down the ship corridors, she took a look around her. It was silent and dim inside the boat. Then Ichiko caught sight of a glowing red lamp on the emergency bell. Clutching at straws, she pressed the button forcefully. After some light resistance, she felt the plastic cover break under her fingertips. The shrill sound of the emergency bell resounded throughout the room. Someone, please! Ichiko thought like a prayer. As she waited for another person to show up, the alarm should have been sounded throughout the entire ship. Someone! Ichiko screamed inside heart with all of her might. Silence fell again, nothing changing. I'm alone here in the middle of the sea with nowhere to run, with some inhuman thing. Ichiko was filled with despair. She noticed a rotten, fishy smell drifting from some distance away. She was aware of it, but was afraid of finding out what it was. A white shadow approached from the other side. A naked body with white, translucent skin emerged from the dimness. The woman had already thrown off her blanket. She had gotten there first. She was struck by severe dizziness and felt the strength leave her limbs. Ichiko didn't even try to put up a fight. She no longer had the strength to keep fighting her fear. The woman already stood right in front of Ichiko. Beneath the face she had seen before, so beautiful it hardly looked real, the skin stretched out across her chest had split open. From the tear that ran from her chest to her abdomen, cloudy fluid spurted out and hit Ichiko in the face. Her tentacles, like something on a strange sea creature, slimily stroked Ichiko's cheek. A muffled scream escaped from her mouth. With her scream, she heard loud laughter. It was an exclamation of joy. The one laughing was the face of a middle-aged woman that protruded from the woman's waist. In response, the countless arms and legs growing out of the woman's body writhed around violently, as though in distress. She didn't want to see anymore. She didn't want to feel anymore. Ichiko shut her eyes tight and tried to convince herself that it was a dream, or maybe a really strange nightmare. If it was a dream, the sooner she woke up, the better. Surely she would wake up in her bed like always. She would smell the breakfast her mother was making and hear her shout up the stairs. And then she would go to school like she always did and tell Noriko about the dream. And Noriko would look at her and say in amazement, "You're still having such kiddie dreams, Ichiko. You read too much manga." There was no way this was real. The man-eating monster was just a product of her own imagination. It's a dream, so it won't hurt. It's okay. It's okay. It's okay. It's okay. Ichiko waited for the moment she would wake up, but however long she waited, it didn't come. She slowly opened her eyes. There she saw the woman moving sluggishly, her back turned. Staring dazed at her, she heard a voice from behind. "Run! Quickly!" It was the strange-sounding voice of a woman. Ichiko turned around. What met her eyes was a woman wearing a dirty blanket. The woman stared at Ichiko, breathing heavily. She had damp black hair, shockingly pale, translucent skin, and big black, cloudy eyes. It was another woman with the same face. Ichiko had no idea what was going on. As she stood there, unable to move, stunned, the woman spoke to her as though pleading. "Please trust me. Hurry." She spoke with extreme difficulty, but the strong urging behind her words came through in the way she spoke. The woman's cloudy eyes locked onto Ichiko's, feeling something, not fear, which she couldn't understand. Ichiko gave a small nod. At the woman's urging, she descended the stairs into the basement. Opening the door, she turned right and continued down the hallway. The woman walked along the dim passageway without hesitation. Seeing this, Ichiko looked as though it looked like she had her sights set on something. The woman stopped in front of her room with "Engine Control Room" written on the door and pointed inside. Following her, Ichiko entered the room. On the woman's walls were rows of various gauges, and in the back right there was a table and an old sofa. The woman sat Ichiko down on the sofa. Ichiko sat silent and motionless watching the woman. This woman and the monster with an identical face to hers. They had to be associated. If she spoke, the woman might change completely, and this made her anxious. The woman remained silent and stared at Ichiko. They stayed this way for a while, in total silence. Suddenly, the woman put her hand on Ichiko's cheek. Tension ran through Ichiko's body like an electric current. Her cheek trembled with a start. Noticing this, the woman spoke. "Don't be afraid. It's all right." The woman smiled at her. It was like the smile of a loving mother. As Ichiko watched her face, she felt that whatever it was she had been frozen by break down. Questions began to pour out of her mouth like a dam had been broken. "Where is everyone? Why did they disappear? What was that? What are you?" Ichiko shook off the woman's hand. We were born as mother's messengers, both of us, together," she murmured, looking down at the ground. The woman's speech, what had first been clumsy, gradually became more fluent. "We were in the sea. When we woke up, we were in here. She awoke first." As she listened to the woman talk, Ichiko remembered the crew's members' conversation. "But I wish we hadn't picked up something so nasty. It's nothing special." It's not nothing special at all. Had they been talking about dragging two identical drowned bodies out of the water together? And then the corpses had revived separately, and the drowned body that had awoken first had done something to the passengers and crew? As Ichiko was lost in thought, the woman kept talking. In the sea, she was influenced by... So she is trying to build a strong shell for herself. We're each only half of the other, so we're weak, fragile. Ichiko didn't understand most of what the woman was saying. I don't really understand what you're talking about, Ichiko murmured, and the woman touched her cheek again, eyes closed, and as she did so, something slipped into Ichiko's consciousness. Overwhelming darkness itself flooded her awareness like a muddy stream. Chaotic darkness, shapeless forms, and infinitely expanding narrow space. A world of nothingness in which none of her five senses functioned. All there was absolute darkness, beyond what her comprehension. Glimpsing this world for not even a second pushed Ichiko over the edge into an abyss of fear. Her body shook violently. Her eyes opened wide, her mouth hanging open, and she screamed, "Ah!" When Ichiko regained consciousness, the woman was still staring at her. I'm sorry, I frightened you. That is where I was born. The woman murmured apologetically and stood. There is no time. All of you must get out of here as quickly as possible. The ship has entered a rift. It's trapped. Quickly, before the rift shifts again. Ichiko was still shaking. She couldn't understand a word the woman was saying. She didn't know what was going to happen to her. In such an extreme situation, Ichiko had no choice but to go along with the woman. As they were leaving the room, the woman suddenly collapsed, like a puppet with severed strings. Her face contorted in agony, and she breathed heavily. Are you okay? What's wrong? Ichiko reflexively rushed over to her. Ichiko put her arms around the woman, trying to lift her. Her blanket was wet, though, with thick, fishy-smelling liquid. Under the damp blanket, she could feel something writhing around. Ichiko instantly withdrew her hand and backed away. My shell will break soon. The woman removed the blanket by herself. White shoulders appeared, and the blanket fell to the ground. Her naked body was covered with smooth skin, and reaching from her chest to her stomach was a white lump. The lump with bumps that resembled a face wriggled around. Each time it moved, a large amount of melted flesh dripped onto the ground. The woman muttered something softly, then she closed her eyes and fell silent. As she crouched down, small shivers running through her body. Ichiko could do nothing but stand and stare. The woman looked up. Her beautiful face was twisted in agony. Her breathing ragged, she pleaded in a cracked voice. Quickly, get out of here. Use the little boat and get far away from here. Little boat? Did she mean the lifeboat that she had seen on the starboard deck? Ichiko put her arms around the woman's shoulders again. Then let's go together. The woman shook her head weakly. I will return to nothing. Like she was influenced. I have felt the influence here of humans. We Inhumans are completely different. It's strange, familiar, a feeling I don't understand. When I found you, I didn't want you to go away. There's still human in me. Before the rift disappears, get out of here together. Before you're trapped, you can't stay here. She could hear the sound from some distance, place of the rumbling of the sea. The rumble ripped through the whole area. Ichiko recalled the image the woman had shown her. Ichiko's instincts told her that the darkness draining all color was approaching. Ichiko knew that this was a second warning. The boat rocked unsteadily, and she could hear the loud sound of the water. Ichiko began to run. She went at full speed, so as to outrun the darkness. If she stayed still, it might catch her. This time, she couldn't let the warning be in vain. But Ichiko didn't realize that she was only continuing down the path to the destination created by the curse. End of chapter 3. So there are 2 doves on board. One of the doves influenced by Odashigo, and is killing the crew to create a big shell. And the second one influenced by humans, so is helping out Ichiko, but the second one is about to die, if haven't died already. So it is time to move on to the 4th and final chapter in Demise. Noriko Kifune. Demise, the cruel drama draws to a close. A squelching sound, like something being chewed, echoed in the darkness. She felt a thick, slimy liquid dribble down her cheek. Noriko Kifune's eyes widened, her face contorted in an expression of fear. Ichiro Nakajima's face stared down at her from above. "I'll protect you no matter what, Noriko. We'll be together forever and ever," Nakajima's face said. But his voice was muffled and hard to make out, like he was speaking underwater. He turned his head impatiently left and right, following her as she backed away. Each time he did so, it made an unpleasant-sounding noise, melting white flesh plopping onto the ground. From Nakajima's neck down, there was only empty space. Buried in the chest of her grotesque woman, though she found it difficult to call the being still human, Nakajima's face squirmed after Noriko. Nakajima jerked out his jaw, and a tentacle of soft white flesh wrapped around his neck. The tentacle, its surface pulsating repulsively, melded with Nakajima's skin, combining them into one. "What's the matter? Noriko? Noriko?" Nakajima's face spoke again with an anxious expression. As he did so, a bizarrely elongated white tongue lolled out of his mouth. A huge amount of rotten-smelling mucus dribbled off of it. At that moment, the string holding Noriko's sanity bound together snapped with a crack. Noriko got to her feet unsteadily, wearing a vacant expression. "Ichiro? Ichiro? Ichiro?" She called Nakajima's name as though delirious. Her eyes were unseeing, her gaze wandering in space. Noriko slowly held out both arms to Nakajima's face. Just as her fingertips were about to make contact with his face, something grabbed onto Noriko's ankle. It held on tightly and jerked her down onto her back. The creature's fleshy tentacles had wrapped around Noriko's ankle. Even as she was dragged across the floor, Noriko simply continued to mutter Nakajima's name. "Noriko!" Oh. Nakajima's face cried in anguish, swinging wildly left and right. His fully extended tongue hit the floor with a wet smack. Noriko floated in midair in an unnatural pose, suspended by one leg. The tentacle let go. Noriko flew across the room. She slammed into the corner of the wheelhouse, the area leading to the stairs, and before she even had time to feel the impact, she tumbled down the stairs, tumbled with a melted wax-like liquid. Mucus-like cloudy sludge had accumulated at the foot of the stairs. Noriko landed in it. The liquid that was scattered from the wheelhouse to the bottom of the stairs gave off the same rotten smell that came from the creature. It was clearly a fluid coming out of the creature's body, and strangely it cushioned the blow to Noriko's body. The moment she fell, Noriko had immediately protected her stomach. Both arms were wrapped around her abdomen. Something inside her felt strange. It was an odd sensation that seemed like it was happening to someone else, like a tiny fish was splashing around inside her. This brought Noriko back to her senses. A desire to live so strong it made her crazy flowed like a torrent through Noriko. The footsteps of the creature echoed from above as it slowly descended the stairs. Enduring the pain, Noriko tried to stand, but her legs were too weak. She crawled along the slimy, mucus-covered floor, proceeding down the corridor. Sensing a presence approaching from behind her, the hairs on the back of her neck prickled. No! Absolutely no way! She had seen many people resist in vain and meet their ends on the boat, filled with agonizing screams. Her chances of escaping from a monster that even a large group of adults couldn't fight were endlessly small. But even still, a part of her beyond reason, her instincts, spurred Noriko on. Barely managing to stand, she opened the door in front of her. Suddenly, she saw something that resembled a pale snake pass by out of the corner of her eye. Swallowing a scream, she turned and shut the door forcefully. Noriko felt something crushed with a squelch. She could see a white, fleshy tentacle, writhing like a snake, trapped in the door. Caught between the door and the wall, the tentacle was severed and fell at Noriko's feet. From the section flowed a thick, sticky liquid, and a bunch of jet-black hair crept out. White teeth fell out from inside the tangled hair. Feeling bile rise in her throat, she turned away. Continuing down the dark passage stretching out to her left, she opened another door. On the other side of the door was the forward deck, filled with pitch-black darkness. The darkness was so profound that it was impossible to tell where the sea ended and the sky began, and Noriko momentarily drew back. The fishy sea breeze wrapped around her body as though it had mass. After momentarily hesitation, Noriko ran out onto the forward deck. She applied her body weight to the door, trying to close it, but it wouldn't shut. She used more force, but the door kept slowly opening bit by bit from the inside. That odor, a smell that reminded her of rotten fish, wafted out through the opening. Keeping her eyes fixed on the door, Noriko backed away. The door slowly opened, and the pale creature emerged into the darkness. The woman's face had already melted into a fleshy white lump, and it was impossible to know what she looked like. The countless human limbs and tentacle-like protrusions all melded together, squirming and entangling, sticky fluid dribbling down the surface of its body. The creature pushed its way onto the forward deck. Nakajima's face was still buried in its chest. He was silent, eyes closed, resembling an elaborate death mask. The creature drew nearer. Noriko matched its movements, retreating, back. The deck slippery, wet with salt water. Noriko lost her balance and tripped. Something hard struck her on the back. Looking around her, she saw a steel fence curving around the forward deck. On the other side of it, the sea was so black, it seemed to melt into the darkness. It was as dark as the depths of the underworld. The creature extended a tentacle towards Noriko, an expression of despair appearing on the cornered girl's face. The tentacle crawled across her body as she pulled back, as though licking her. The discomfort was so strong, she felt like she was about to lose consciousness, and she suppressed the returning nausea. As though hesitating, the tentacle stopped at Noriko's abdomen. She saw it momentarily pause clearly. Noriko reflexively let out a breath. As she did so, the tentacle slipped quickly under the hem of her shirt. The soft white tentacle melted her skin, invading Noriko's stomach. It throbbed and wiggled like the stomach of a caterpillar as it passed through her, and she felt it enter her. She tried to grab the tentacle with both hands and tear it out, but it wouldn't come out. She felt no pain. All she felt, suffocated and unable to move, was heat begin to spread throughout her stomach. The inside of her head was foggy and blank, her body weak. Feeling a sensation like joy, Noriko closed her eyes. Not even knowing whether she was standing or lying down, she was enveloped in the sticky fluid. Noriko's consciousness faded, and then something caught her attention. "Noriko, run!" Hearing a voice, Noriko opened her eyes a crack and looked up. Nakajima's face, in the center of the translucent white lump of flesh obstructing her view, was shouting. Now, Nakajima's face were wide open. "Ichiro?" Noriko murmured softly. Dragging along Nakajima's face, chin up, the creature's body heading toward the iron railing, the tentacle left Noriko's body. The creature leaned over the railing and continued turning into a circle. It looped back in a curve, going over the railing and falling into the sea. The whole ship lurched hugely. A moment passed. There was a loud splash. "Ichiro!" she screamed over the railing. Spray rose from the water's surface, splashing Noriko all over. The spray subsided, the water going calm. The huge white body drifted to the surface. In the center of it was Nakajima's face. His eyes were closed. Suddenly, the black-stained surface of the sea began to tremble and swell like jelly. Strange black waves, no, things that resembled waves, filled the water and simultaneously surged upon the creature's body. The writhing, trembling black masses seemed to emit cries of joy as they covered the creature's entire body. They appeared endlessly, one after another. The creature, set upon by the countless swarm of lumps, sank back beneath the waves, along with Nakajima's face. Still gripping the iron railing with both hands, Noriko slid to the floor. "Ichiro!" She began to sob uncontrollably. Still staring at the black depths that had swallowed the creature in Nakajima, she continued to wail. She wrapped her arms around herself, the one whose life Nakajima had given his all to save. But Noriko had no idea what she was supposed to do next. Suddenly, the crouching Noriko was illuminated by a beam of white light. Used to the darkness, she was blinded by its brightness. The patter of trainer-wearing footsteps approached. Withstanding the pain it caused her eyes, she looked intently the direction of the light it was coming from. Her eyes gradually adjusted, and she was able to make out a silhouette. The familiar trainers in school uniform, hair and pigtails. As she absent-mindedly watched the figure, she suddenly felt her shoulders being violently shaken. "Noriko? Noriko! We have to get out of here! Hurry!" Before her eyes was the face of Ichiko Yagura, who held a torch. "Ichiko? Is that you?" Noriko murmured her friend's name in disbelief. She couldn't keep up with what was going on. "Come on, Noriko, stand up quickly. We have to hurry or it'll..." Ichiko linked arms with the stunned-looking Noriko. She desperately tried to stand up. Everyone's... Ichiro, too." Ignoring Noriko's repeated sobs, her head down, Ichiko pleaded with her in a firm voice. "You're always helping me out, so this time I'll help you. Get up, quickly. You can't just give up." Ichiko was always timid, keeping her eyes on the ground, but now there was a strong determination in those eyes. Noriko gave a small nod, mustering all of her strength and standing. Ichiko and Noriko arrived at the starboard deck. "If we get on this, we can get out of here." Illuminated by Ichiko's torch was a small lifeboat that had been installed on the ship. As Ichiko moved closer to the railing to examine the lifeboat mechanism, the boat gave a big lurch. The sea swelled hugely, as though swallowing something, striking the ship. The torch Ichiko had been holding fell into the sea. It lit up the madly raging sea, dyed bright red. Right away, Noriko, clinging to the iron railing, heard Ichiko's scream. "Ah!" Ichiko was on the other side of the railing. The hand that was grabbing onto the top of the railing slipped. At once, Noriko ran over and grabbed onto Ichiko's hand. With all her might, Noriko tried to pull Ichiko up. It hurt so much it felt like her shoulders would tear off. Her ribs pressed up against the railing creaked. Gritting her teeth, she took the pain. "I've had enough of this. Just let Ichiko at least be okay." As Noriko tried with all her strength to haul Ichiko up, a pain ran through her stomach. Again that sensation returned. The grip of Noriko's hand gripping onto Ichiko's slackened. Ichiko's eyes stared into Noriko's. Ichiko's hand slipped down her arm. "Inside my stomach, Ichiro's," Noriko murmured, an anguished expression on her face. Ichiko's hand gripped onto the bracelet on Noriko's wrist, their matching bracelets symbolizing their constant promise to be friends forever. The moment the bracelet snapped, Noriko let of Ichiko's hand. "No!" Ichiko's scream made the air tremble, and then ceased. "You're in there, aren't you?" Noriko heard a woman's voice say from behind her. Turning around, she saw a figure wearing a dirty, stained blanket. Even through the blanket, she could tell that the body was trembling slightly. The moment she heard the voice, she felt that she was under something else's control. Her lips moved, not of her own volition, and she spoke. "Listen, it's Mother's voice." The whole area shook violently, surrounded by a thunderous roar. The Red Sea howled, and then a siren sounded. The siren has sounded. The Red Sea, filled with red water, drifting, 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 drifting. She could hear a woman speaking in a whisper. "That girl's dying scream broadened the rift. Mother is angry. Where will we go when the rift closes? Its desire tired me. I want to sleep a little, until I waken again. The rift is closing. Ah, I can see that girl. I will meet her again." The voices stopped. Her consciousness began to fade, melting, 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 melt. Shikai News for August 1986, Morning Edition. A survivor of the Bright Wind has been discovered. The ship is still missing, and it is thought that there is no chance of finding further survivors. It has been announced by the Coast Guard that at around 4 p.m. on the 3rd, a single survivor was rescued from the sea off the coast of Yamajima Island. The girl rescued, miraculously found floating in the sea, is Miss Noriko Kifune, 14, a second year at Kamishino Middle School. Ferry mysteriously disappears. Middle school girl miraculously saved. For some time, the incident made headlines as an unprecedented mystery. The search for the ferry, which suddenly vanished, and its passengers, was incredibly troublesome. Noriko, the only survivor found, had lost all of her memories concerning the incident. Due to the fact that she was a minor, aggression from the media was restrained by the law, and for several months public attention turned to other matters. Noriko's mother watched her daughter, wearing a complicated expression. Her daughter, who at such a young age had such a heavy burden to bear. Noriko held 2 small babies, one encradled in each arm, 2 irreplaceable lives. In exchange for them, Noriko had lost so many things. Attuned to their mother's feelings, the 2 babies smiled at her, perhaps to alleviate her grief. In response, the young mother murmured in a low voice, "Ryuko, Ikuko." For a brief while, there was peace, and then, waking at the end of a peaceful sleep, the nightmare seems to begin again. The end. So that is the mystery of the Bright Wind. It gives us some information about why, even though the Bright Wind was on Yamajima Island, in Mother's Realm, there were no passengers. Only Ichiko, and even then it wasn't the real Ichiko. It was the copy of Ichiko. Where did everyone go? Well, we found out. We found that one of the doves that was pulled on board absorbed everyone to try to create a shell for itself. And the only ones who were not killed and absorbed were Noriko and Ichiko. And Ichiro, who had been absorbed, used his strength of will to save Noriko, to force the dove to walk overboard, apparently. That's what I got from that anyway. That it forced, like, he was able to make it walk overboard. It fell into the sea, and from what it sounded like that the dove was torn apart by Shiryo, who were in the water. Ichiko was going to survive the incident, but unfortunately, due to the rocking boat due to the water, she just fell overboard. Too bad for Ichiko. And when Ichiko fell into the water, she drowned and died, and because she died in the water, the Otoshigo was able to use her to create a copy, an avatar for itself, that was then sent into the copy of Yamajima Island to find Mother. Noriko survived, fell into the water at some point, was pulled out. Yeah, because the Bright Wind was moved into the other realm, but Noriko wasn't. So does that mean that the ship just vanished, but Noriko didn't? And then she just fell into the water because she was kind of in the air? Is how I'm picturing that. She fell into the water and was the only one found. And because of the legend that we read about how pregnant women should not go in the water, well, she gave birth to twins who were connected to Mother, Ryuko and Ikuko. Ryuko, we know, was a dove. Ikuko had psychic powers, and we were wondering, is she a dove? Or maybe she's a dove who was not awoken. Who can say? But we can say what happened on the Bright Wind, because we read this little flash story that you can read at the website there, if you want to read it yourself. That has been the story of the mystery of the Bright Wind.